The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. I was talking to a friend the other week, and she said, if people knew what I knew, that guy would not be pastoring that church. And I got to thinking about how to respond when God seems to turn a blind eye to major character flaws or maybe even serious offenses that are committed by public leaders. And there's an interesting description of this kind of scene happening in the book of 1 Samuel. Israel's golden era began when they had their own land and they got their first king, whose name was Saul. Now, Saul was not God's first choice. God's best for Israel was not to have a human king at all. God told the prophet Samuel, it's not you that they've rejected, but they've rejected me as their king. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. And at the beginning of the story, Saul is a man of humility. He says, who am I to lead this great nation? And he's a man of mercy. We read in 1 Samuel 11:13 that when he has the chance to get vengeance against people who resisted his kingship, he said, no one will be put to death today. And yet early in his reign, his leadership failures disqualify him from leadership. We read in 1 Samuel 13 that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 2 years before things took a tragic turn. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 7 through 14, we read, some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. And he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal. And Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. And just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. And Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal. And I've not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Later in the story, Saul attacks the Amalekites, and rather than destroying their best livestock, per Samuel's instruction, he spares them. And Saul tells Samuel, I regret that I've made Saul king, because he turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel tells Saul, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And then Saul says to Samuel, I've sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. And yet, even though God has rejected Saul as king, Saul remains on the throne. We read later in the book of Acts, where the Apostle Paul says, after removing Saul, God made David their king, and God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. But even after God chooses Saul's successor in David, Saul remains on the throne. And Saul gets jealous of this emerging star in his shadow. And when Saul tries to kill David in a fit of rage, he still retains his position. And when he tries to kill David a second time, God does not remove him. Years go by. Nothing happens. We get to 1 Samuel 28, and we read this. The Philistines, who is kind of the perpetual thorn in Saul's side, the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. And when Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor, they said. So Saul goes to Endor in disguise because he's expelled all of the mediums and spiritists from the country. And the medium calls up the spirit of Samuel, who has recently passed from beyond the grave. And Samuel's spirit tells Saul, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. And the Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. And the Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. Here, my heart actually breaks for Saul a little. He's been living in fear his whole life. At the beginning of the story, he's afraid of his call to be king, and later, he's afraid of his men when they start to scatter. He thinks he's going to lose his influence over them. And then he's afraid of David's influence, and that's a threat that he constantly has to manage. And then he's afraid of God's silence. After Samuel passes, he doesn't know how to hear from God anymore. And then, at the very last day of his life, he's afraid of the Philistines. And the next day, true to Samuel's word, Saul dies on the battlefield, but still dies as king. So here's my question, and I think my friend's question as well. If Saul had been disqualified from leadership 2 years into his reign, why did God let him rule another 38? Especially with a gifted and anointed leader on deck, David, who's wired and ready to go. And the answer is, I don't know. Even so, there are two key lessons to learn from this story. The first, never confuse position. Just because someone rises to or retains a position of influence doesn't mean that God is with them or for them. It only means that God allows them to be in that seat for reasons only known to God. So never confuse position with favor. And never confuse God's delay with justice as a denial of justice. Never confuse God's delay with God's denial. God will call dangerous leaders to account. And when God does, that reckoning will bring glory to God and healing to those who have been harmed. As hard as it is for us to understand, God's justice is always better than our vengeance. And yes, like David, or like my friend, you might have to wait years, even decades, for the truth to come out. And for God's full wisdom in that whole scenario to be revealed. But it will. It will. One day, it will. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.